Hi, should you trust me with the summary? I don't live in the States, so I have the privilege of not giving a fuck about fitting into one of your boxes. And why should us, the rest of the world, care? Like it or not, whatever you Americans do culturally and politically spreads, and not just through the Western world. To put it simply, you are giving people ideas. Yes, I read all 922 pages, and since I do not expect anyone else to do it, I did it for you. I did not talk about everything that's in there. The assumption here is that this is going to be watched by someone moderately educated on politics and someone who has a basic idea of what conservative ideas generally are. Now, how to listen to what I'm about to tell you. You should be constantly aware that this is a politically motivated writing. Take everything you are going to hear with a gigantic grain of salt. Keep in mind that just because it is written in a book does not mean that it is gospel. So, what is it? It is a collection of essays. Finished in 2023, it was written by hundreds of people. Not all the authors agree on everything that is written in there. First, they absolutely expect the president to read it all. As cultural Marxism has infiltrated American institutions, they hope to deconstruct the administrative state. They want a database of conservatives, then to teach them how to lead. Then they want the return of God. Forward, and they already mentioned toxic normalization of transgenderism, corn invading school libraries. They see a parallel between today and the late 70s, where the Heritage Foundation claims credit for unifying the right of that time with their Mandate for Leadership project. It was adopted by Reagan, who by the end of his first year implemented 60%, their words, not mine, of their policy proposals. While the authors disagree on things, there are four core pillars, their common goals. 1. Restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. #fatherlessness crisis. The next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity and inclusion, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. Also, no gender ideology and critical race theory. Outlaw pornography. Roe v. Wade overturning was just the beginning. They want to outlaw choice in every jurisdiction in America. 2. Dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. They want the Congress to be able to pass budget bills again, and overall not delegate decision-making to federal agencies with unelected bureaucrats. They are against environmental protections, DHS helping migrants illegally enter, national defense. Apparently there is a need of restoration of confidence in this institution. They need to protect the homeland and the American interests overseas. Defeating the Chinese Communist Party should be priority number 1. 3. Defend national sovereignty, borders, and stand up against global threats. Elites need to be humble. Everyone has the right to say how the country should run. The aim of the left is to destroy the nation-state. The environmental protections that are being enacted are useless and only serve to strengthen the powers of the elites. Globalization and open trade with China has been a disaster to the average worker and only served to enrich corporations. 4. Pursuit of happiness is not to do what you want, but what you ought to do. Family, work, religious devotion, and spirituality. Volunteering, charities. Socialism doesn't work. Uphold the Constitution against executive actions. You need to uphold the separation of powers among the three government branches and the separation of powers between the federal government and the states. The next administration must not give power to nonpartisan experts who pursue their own ends. 1. White House office. The president must rely on his cabinet and choose people who represent and are deeply committed to his agenda. Loyalty to the president and the Constitution should take precedent over elite credentials of advisors. 2. Executive Office of the President of the United States. Current administration is woke, must dismantle administration. President should rely on the advisors that he picks. Budget should be allocated from existing, not borrowed funds to ensure fiscal responsibility. They would like transparency about entities that are awarded federal contracts and use government contracts to push back against woke policies in corporate America. Some notable executive orders and laws which they want implemented back. 13771. That new environmental regulations either cost nothing, earn money, or there should be a proposal of what other regulations need to be replaced by the new ones. 13777. Reviewing all existing regulations and deciding what to do with them. 13891. Transparency about the bureaucracy guidelines documents for regulations. Trump required each agency made an indexed and searchable database, and these were started to be rolled out, but then Biden ordered the databases to be scrapped altogether. I fact-checked this, it is true. Next, 13892, which tried to ensure that the public is provided with fair notice of regulations. 12630, eminent domain should be revised and signed again. The US must rebalance and refocus international trading relationships in favor of democratic nations that embrace free, fair, and open trade principles built on market-driven economies. Reorienting the global trading system, protect US interests in the global marketplace more effectively. National Space Council must do race with China. 3. Central personnel agencies. Currently, expert merit rather than political appointments rule within the federal bureaucracy. As frustration with the bureaucracy grew and with it calls to drain the swamp, are they sure that is what was meant by draining the swamp? Merit shields people from political pressure and accountability. Performance of a worker is not currently tied to their pay. Hiring based on intelligence tests had been previously scrapped down as discriminatory. They want to reinstate it back. Reforming federal retirement benefits, fully indexed for inflations, that is too generous. The savings of the government would be gigantic here. Reductions of the number of federal employees in such a way that it would reduce costs. Currently, there are 2 million federal employees and 10 times more federal contractors than employees. Congress should also consider whether public sector unions are appropriate in the first place. Privatize where possible. Common defense. Recruiting was the worst in 2022 than it was in 2 generations. De-wokify the military. China is the biggest threat to America, as they are in arms race and soon they might have nuclear capabilities that match or exceed those of the States. They want to ensure that America's allies in Asia are impossible for China to take, but not at all costs. It should be approved by Congress. Congress must also again be deciding whether to go to war or not. Defense should be a priority and more weapons need to be manufactured in the US. Close the Department of Homeland Security. Reform the US Agency for International Development, as it now promotes a cultural and political agenda of, well, the left. 4. Department of Defense. Largest part of the federal government, almost 3 million people serving in uniform or a civilian capacity throughout the world, and the department consumes approximately 850 billion USD annually. It is more than 50% of the government's discretionary spending. By the way, they call the withdrawal from Afghanistan disastrous. All in all, military in decay and decline. We must go back. Protect Taiwan. Increase burden sharing of defense of US allies. Transform NATO so that US allies theoretically have the vast majority of force required to deter Russia's conventional forces attack and rely on the states mainly for their nuclear deterrent. Sustain support for Israel. Empower South Korea to take the lead in its conventional defense against North Korea. Since the supply chain of weapons manufacturing relies on overseas trade, reorient that trade to allies in case there is an actual war. Facilitate trade with allies, create opportunities for the allies to contribute. Recruiters should also have more access to schools that get federal funding, and students should be required to do the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. People with gender dysphoria should be expelled from military service. Restore service members to active duty who were discharged because they refused the vaccine. No DEI in the military. Social media should only be used for recruitment. Funding abortion for service members should be ended. Reduce the number of generals. Intelligence reporting should be unbiased. Align collection and analysis with vital national interests. Invest more in machine learning and artificial intelligence to exploit open source and classified intelligence data. Rebuild the army. Budget needs to be increased, more and faster research and development. Increase the personnel by 50,000. Address the suicide problem within the military. Marine Corps. A document called Force Design 2030 by Marine Corps General David H. Whatever. The transformation proposed there should be implemented. It is a preparation for a naval war with China. In regards to Space Force, they want not only defensive but also offensive infrastructure. Declassify what the government knows about current threats in space. Explore the creation of Space Force Academy to attract top talent. Nuclear deterrence, need of modernization and restoring of the infrastructure. Arms control agreements only if they are in the interest of the USA and its allies. Missile defense. Build, invest in infrastructure. Reject the leftist notions that missile defense is destabilizing. 5. Department of Homeland Security. Dismantle the DHS. The department and its parts can be absorbed by others. If that cannot be done, replace the entire DHS Advisory Committee as soon as possible. Customs and Border Protection. Restructuring. Single nationwide detention standard for immigrants. Eliminate T and U visas, victims of trafficking that help law enforcement, and the cap is at $5,000 per year. And with U, these are victims of certain crimes that help law enforcement, and the cap is at $10,000 per year. S visas should be used for these people. Those people who would otherwise be inadmissible to or deportable from the United States. But the current cap of that category is at 250. Anyway, unless and until T and U visas are repealed, they should be significantly reformed and standards should be raised. Eliminate or significantly reduce the number of visas issued to foreign students from enemy nations. ICE should work anywhere in the States and without warrant where appropriate. Eliminate sensitive zones where ICE are not allowed to operate. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. They need to again focus on merit-based immigration that rewards high-skilled aliens rather than prioritizing extended family and luck-of-the-draw immigrations. Diversity visa lottery should be repealed. Chain migration ended while focusing on the nuclear family. People deciding on whether to process migrants into the states need to go live in the communities that are affected by their decisions. If the border becomes overwhelmed, reserve the right to expel migrants immediately. Unaccompanied minors. Repeal Section 235 Trafficking Victims Protection, which provides numerous immigration benefits to unaccompanied children. If it needs to exist, then there should be a clause allowing for a return of these kids back to their home countries. Asylum reform. Raising the standards for credible fear of persecution. Gang violence and domestic violence are not grounds for asylum. NGOs should not process and transport immigrants through the states. Higher standards for H-1B visa. Limit the classes of aliens eligible for work authorization. Secretary of Homeland Security determines whether a mass migration event is imminent and with the approval of the President may make rules that make it so the crisis is averted. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, is overburdened. Currently, the disaster declaration thresholds are apparently easy to meet, and Congress should change the cost-share arrangement so that the federal government covers from 25 to 75% of costs for the biggest disasters. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Of utmost urgency is ending their counter mis- and disinformation efforts. The federal government cannot be the arbiter of truth. U.S. Secret Service should transfer their investigations to DOJ and the Department of Treasury, those investigations that are not related to its protective function, except for financial crimes associated with illegal immigration. TSA should be privatized, and only the intelligence aspect of it should remain with the government. Office of Strategy, Policy and Plans. Review of the counter-domestic terrorism efforts to ensure they are consistent with President's priorities, congressional authorization, and Americans' constitutional rights. Re-evaluate the censorship efforts. Remove anyone who participated in censorship. Office of Intelligence and Analysis should be eliminated. Did not add value and has been weaponized for domestic political purposes. Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman and Office of the Citizenship and Immigration Services Ombudsman both should ideally be eliminated. Sanctions to countries that refuse to accept their migrants for return. Only U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents utilize or occupy federally subsidized housing. 6. Department of State should be focused on national interest. More political appointees where possible. All ambassadors required to submit a letter of resignation at the start of a new administration. Previously, only those of perceived political appointees were accepted. Now, review all personnel and review things in progress, whether they align with the President's agenda. The U.S. should demand visa reciprocity, that is, to limit access to foreign nationals from countries that do not respond in kind, including countries that are actively hostile. China. They say that the root of the problem is in China's strategic culture and not just the Marxism-Leninism of the CCCP, meaning that internal culture and civil society will never deliver a more normative nation. Iran. Its people have struggled to achieve democracy. And here we have an insinuation that it is time to take steps to draw Iran into the community of free and modern nations. Venezuela, insinuation of thoughts about helping to achieve democracy. Western Hemisphere, shift manufacturing and industry from places like China to Central and South American countries. Middle East and North Africa, prevent Iran from obtaining nukes, reinstating Trump-era sanctions. Support freedom-seeking Iranians, give Israel what it needs/demands to defend itself against Iran and its proxies. More countries should enter Abraham Accords, which are peace treaty, diplomatic ties, and full normalization of relations with Israel. Defund Palestinian Authority. Keep Turkey in the Western fold, a NATO ally, and prevent it from hedging with China and such. Therefore, the US has to rethink its support for the Kurds. Strengthen ties with Saudi Arabia. Protect freedom of navigation in the Gulf, Red Sea, and Suez Canal. Sub-Saharan Africa has resources and such. Incentivize and facilitate US private sector engagement in these countries. Counter Chinese activity on the continent. Digital hygiene program. Recognition of Somaliland statehood as a hedge against the US deteriorating position in Djibouti. Stop promoting policies birthed in the American culture wars. Europe. Urgently develop trade with the UK before the EU takes it back, trade-wise. South and Central Asia. Strengthening relations with India. No expectation of normal relations with either Afghanistan or Pakistan. The Arctic. Russia invests in the Arctic. NATO must acknowledge that it also exists in the Arctic and develop and implement an Arctic strategy. It would be cool if there was a US consulate in Nuuk. Enhance ties between the States and Greenland. International organizations. Reconsider if membership serves US interests. Review all current memberships. No funding if these organizations fund anything that is prohibited by federal law, including but not limited to abortion, population control, promote family, life, national sovereignty. 7. Intelligence community. Dewokify. About the Executive Order 12333, Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. Revise it to account for current threats. Threats in cyberspace, bioweapons. Establish the Director of National Intelligence's authority over the intelligence community. CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, was established by National Security Act in 1947. Public servants must be mindful that they are required to help the president implement his agenda while remaining apolitical, upholding the Constitution and laws of the United States, and earning the public trust. Unbiased and apolitical foreign intelligence information, allowing the Office of Director of National Intelligence and CIA leadership to shrink size and reduce duplication of effort while promoting healthy turnover within senior ranks. The intelligence community should be prohibited from monitoring so-called domestic disinformation. It can easily slip into suppression of an opposition party's speech. Classification and declassification of information needs to be automated. There is too much stuff to manually review. They are dissatisfied with the EU's limits on data exports. They point out the hypocrisy that China is not subjected to the same laws. And they harm military and intelligence capabilities of the states. It is time to push back. National Intelligence Council. There should be a quota so that it is at least 50% populated by non-CIA personnel. The Director of National Intelligence is the head of the intelligence community, not CIA. The new administration should make that clear. 8. Media agencies. U.S. Agency for Global Media. Their mission is to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. They are apparently not promoting content that the Heritage Foundation is okay with. Necessary reform? There are security issues. Apparently it is vulnerable to exploitation by foreign spies. Budget cuts, no duplicities. Foreign journalists have the I visa, not the J visa. The J visa makes it easier to transition into American jobs. Do not completely disregard the radio for the future, as it would be necessary in times of conflict. In times of peace, internet makes sense, but it is fragile and non-functioning in authoritarian countries. There should be some liaison that coordinates activities with the National Security Council. State Department oversight is vital to ensure that the agency adheres to its original mission. Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Republican presidents have tried to strip CPB of taxpayer funding. Public broadcasting slips into leftist talking points, and that, according to Thomas Jefferson, is sinful and tyrannical against the other half of the country that basically pays to have their views suppressed. And NPR, PBS have mostly left audiences anyway. Big news, by the way, the Sesame Street is biased to the left. 9. Agency for International Development. This agency needs to support societies that are less likely to act against American interests and more likely to respect family, life, and religious liberty. Under Trump, it promoted international religious freedom as a pillar of the agency's work and built up an unprecedented genocide response infrastructure. Cease war on fossil fuels, end cooperation with organizations that promote climate fanaticism, DEI agenda, de-wokeify, eliminate, refocusing gender equality on women, children, and families, protecting life in foreign assistance, no international funding of abortions from tax dollars, accountability of international organizations, language promoting abortion should be removed from UN documents, policy statements, and technical literature, and programs in Yemen, Syria, and Afghanistan. Transition humanitarian aid into development aid. Better branding. Yes, this particular aid is from the US. Foreign aid must advance the Abraham Accords. Do not export progressive American culture to Africa, they don't want it. Environmental regulations denied Africa easy access to energy and fertilizers and exacerbated hunger and poverty. Latin America. Leftist victories from Mexico to Chile. These regimes are hostile to American interests. Challenge the socialist ideas that have captivated these nations' youth. Deregulation, trade, and investment there. Little interlude. Through 2020, Medicare and Medicaid cost $17.8 trillion. Deficit was $17.9 trillion. Their conclusion is, in essence, the deficit problem is a Medicare and Medicaid problem. The next administration should eliminate any offices within the FBI that it has the power to eliminate without any action from Congress. 10. Department of Agriculture. Biden wants to put climate to the forefront. They don't think so. USDA should not control and shape the economy but remove obstacles that hinder food production. Foreign trade barriers should be removed. Food productivity and affordability should be a priority before climate change. Repeal the federal sugar program. Its very purpose is to limit the sugar supply in order to increase prices. The program has a regressive effect since lower-income households spend more of their money to meet food needs. Move welfare programs to DHHS. Re-implement work requirements to qualify for SNAP food stamps. Trump wanted to reform the food stamp program in such a way that out of the 40 million beneficiaries in 2021, only 688,000 people would be eligible in that year. Return to the original purpose of school meals. Provide food to children from low-income families while at school. Today, these increasingly resemble entitlement programs. USDA should further not provide meals to students during the summer unless students are taking summer school classes. Reject efforts to create universal free school meals. Land conservation efforts are government overreach. Deregulate. Remove obstacles for innovation. Stop the negative connotation behind genetically engineered food. Repeal federal labeling mandate. Voluntary is allowed. Repeal the dietary guidelines or at minimum reform them. 11. Department of Education. Limited federal education policy and ultimately the Federal Department of Education should be eliminated. Publicly funded, but education decisions are made by families. Expose schools to greater market forces. No student loan forgiveness. Student results are abysmal. Restructuring. Funding for people with disabilities distributed directly to local education agencies by Department of Health and Human Services. Office of Federal Student Aid. Completely reverse the student loan federalization of 2010, spin-off FSA and student loan obligations to federal loans assigned directly by the Treasury. No non-binary category, define sex as biological and assign at birth. Trump administration's Title IX protected the foundational right of due process for those who are accused of sexual misconduct. The Biden's administration proposed change to the interpretation of Title IX disposes of these rights. If schools had bad stats under the Obama administration on how they treat students of different races, they could lose funding. End this. And the notion that when one group of students is overrepresented in special education, that this requires intervention. Provide school meals to children in need. Do not use federal meals to support radical ideology. No income-driven repayment of student loans. Income exception to be equal to the poverty line, and require payments of 10% of income above the exemption. No loan forgiveness if possible, or if that is not possible, forgive remaining balance after 25 years. Connect educational outcomes with risk level of students and their socioeconomic backgrounds to get accurate data. New legislation. Stop the spread of critical race theory. States should require schools to post classroom materials online to provide maximum transparency to parents. No public education employee or contractor shall use a name to address a student other than the name listed on a student's birth certificate, without the written permission of a student's parents or guardians. No use of other pronouns other than what is the biological sex of the student without the written permission of parents or guardians. Nobody should be required to use a different pronoun if it goes against their religious or moral convictions. Additional reforms, allowing states to opt out of federal education programs. Higher education reform. Accreditation agencies demand that institutions adopt DEI. Must be stopped. Imposing ideological preferences on colleges. Reporting of Chinese investments in American education. New executive orders. Bachelor degree should not be required for any federal job unless the requirements of the job specifically demand it. Demand a report on how many dollars of federal grants and programs actually make it to classrooms. Pursue antitrust against accreditors, especially the American Bar Association. 12. Department of Energy and related commissions. The U.S. is becoming energy dependent on China. Nationalization is dangerous. Banks and governments decide who is worthy of funding. There are cyber attacks against U.S. energy infrastructure from adversaries. Stop the war on fossil fuels. Secure infrastructure. Also, cybersecurity is vital. Innovation. Assess international energy issues that threaten U.S. national security. Eliminate political and climate change interference in Department of Energy approvals of LNG exports. Expand automatic approvals to all allies such as NATO countries and nations with free trade agreements with the U.S. in a timely manner. Stop using energy policy to advance politicized social agendas. Promote American energy interests. Accelerate the cleanup from the Manhattan Project and Cold War. Potentially leave some of it to the private sector to dispose of nuclear waste. Accelerate the cleanup and ban non-proliferation activities. Pursue the processing of critical minerals. Now the vast majority are mined, processed, or both in Russia and China. And focus on climate change and green subsidies. Eliminate energy efficiency standard for appliances. Taxpayers should not subsidize new risky energy innovations. Instead, that should be left to the private sector. Energy Information Administration is not inherently a problematic agency, historically provided independent and impartial analysis. Oppose climate reparations to developing countries from developed countries for their use of fossil fuels. Arctic Energy Office. Defend American interests in the Arctic Circle. Expand operations to Alaska. National Nuclear Security Administration. Provide and maintain nuclear deterrent. New nuclear warheads a top priority. And needed plutonium production capabilities. Divest from non-nuclear activities to nuclear. Energy reliability and resilience. Infrastructure security. RTO, regional transmission organizations, direct RTOs so that the benefits of renewables like tax credits and no fuel costs are passed on to customers. RTOs should be voluntary rather than imposed on regions that do not want them. 13. Environmental Protection Agency. Conservative EPA should focus on local and state efforts. The agency is a Congress-approved regulator, not an all-powerful policymaker. In some instances, those efforts push industries overseas to countries that do not have such regulations. It is a false choice that it is either environment or the economy. Reform, significant restructuring and review of status quo. Office of Air and Radiation. Under the Good Neighbor program, which aims to reduce smog and nitrogen oxide, review Biden-era regulations to ensure they do not over-control upwind states in violation of the statute as construed by the U.S. Supreme Court. Identify a reasonably discrete group of violators. Remove the greenhouse gas reporting program for any source category that is not currently being regulated. Not everyone who has to report emissions have a cap on emissions. Restore the Trump era once in, always in. Once a pollutant is a major pollutant, it must always follow the strictest rules. That was not the case for Trump. If the emissions of whoever fall below a certain threshold, the requirements for emissions can adjust. Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights should be disbanded. Current issuances of grants show no meaningful changes in environmental quality. Review all grants based on need and not ideological affiliation or academic preference, towards projects that will tangibly improve the environment. Generally, political appointees where possible in key positions. 14. Department of Health and Human Services. If the Department of Health and Human Services were a separate country, its approximately $1.6 trillion budget would rank as the world's fifth largest national budget. De-wokeify, it has lost its way. Goal 1 is to protect life, conscience, and bodily integrity, which is rooted in biological realities, not ideology. From the moment of conception, every human being possesses inherent dignity and worth. Abortion and euthanasia are not healthcare. Insurance system induces overconsumption of healthcare, limits consumer shopping, and hides true costs from patients. Reduce burdens on regulatory compliance, encouraging innovation, allow alternative insurance coverage options. Promote stable and flourishing married families, mother-father children. If adoption is needed, it should be fast and supported by the HHS. Prepare for the next health emergency. Never again should unaccountable bureaucrats like Anthony Fauci have brought unchecked powers. Transparency, accountability, and oversight. CDC should be separated into two agencies, one that reports on data and one that makes health recommendations and policies. The second is an inescapably political function. CDC Foundation currently accepts big pharma contributions. Conflict of interest. Modernize data infrastructure. Vaccine safety programs should be transferred to the FDA. Currently, not all states report abortion statistics. Accurate data needed. They want a database from blue states reporting how many abortions, at what gestational period, for what reason, the mother's state of residence, and by what method. CDC should end data on gender identity. FDA. Brand name pharmaceuticals slow down or impede entrance of generic products into the marketplace. It would lower costs. Encourage more dependable generic drug manufacturing. It would mean more supplies, so there are no shortages. Abortion pills. Mifepristone pill and misoprostol pill are currently approved for up to 10 weeks or 70 days. Before Biden, it required an in-person visit with a physician. FDA should reverse the approval of the abortion pill. Federal laws apparently prohibit mailing abortion drugs. In-person requirement again. Ensure reporting of abortion pill complications. Make the option for ethically manufactured vaccines to be imported into the states, vaccines that are not linked to abortion. Reviewers from the FDA should not be allowed to then go work for pharmaceutical companies. Paid advertising by big pharma should be regulated. National Institute of Health, world's largest biomedical research agency. They do research using fetal tissue obtained from selective abortions, which some could consider immoral and obsolete. Fund ethical alternatives. 3-parent embryo creation and human cloning research should be banned. Their monopoly on directing research should be broken. CDC and NIH foundations need to be decommissioned. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Enhance conscience protection regulations. Providers should not feel compelled to provide sex changes and similar services. Affordable Care Act serves special interests of large hospital systems and undercuts consumer choice of high quality and specialty care. Medicare cannot pay in physician-owned and specialty hospitals. Remove those restrictions so all can compete in serving Medicare patients. Price transparency regulations should be put into law. Medicaid. Failing waste, fraud, abuse. Add work requirements for Medicaid. Disincentivize permanent dependence. Eliminate middle-income to upper-income Medicaid recipients. Affordable Care Act and private health insurance. Remove barriers to direct primary care. Direct billing without contacting insurance. Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight. Prohibit abortion travel funding. Prohibit Planned Parenthood from receiving Medicaid funds. Disqualify elective abortions from Medicaid programs. Withdraw federal Medicaid funds up to 10% for states that require abortion coverage in private health insurance plans. No national coverage regarding gender reassignment surgery for Medicare beneficiaries. Enforce EMTALA, which requires stabilization of the fetus if there is active labor. The undeniable reality of abortion is that it does not always result in a dead baby. Those born alive babies are left to die. They want an investigation of those instances. Teen pregnancy prevention and personal responsibility education program. No promotion of high-risk sexual behavior. Risk avoidance should be prioritized. Adoption reform. Office of Refugee Resettlement should be moved to DHS. Should never be allowed to facilitate abortions for unaccompanied children. They should be treated with dignity, not trafficked across state lines to be victimized by the abortion industry. Office of Child Support Enforcement requires more monitoring of all the support for the child so that both parents acknowledge how much is being spent on the child. This thing called Healthy Marriage and Relationship Education Program focuses on early interventions. The program grants should be available to faith-based recipients who affirm that marriage is between not just any two adults, but one man and one unrelated. Why do you need to specify that? Woman. Swift termination of parental rights for children in foster care if these parents do not make an effort to be involved. Restore Trump-era religious and moral exemptions to the contraceptive mandate. Expand inclusion of fertility awareness-based methods, calendar method, fertile days, temperature, and supplies to family planning in the Women's Preventive Services mandate. Eliminate the week after pill from the contraceptive mandate as a potential abortion pill. Restrict DHHS ability to declare indefinite public health emergencies. Congress should establish a time frame for any public health emergency and place the burden of proof why an extension is necessary on the Secretary. Withdraw HIPAA guidance on abortion. Patient privacy following overturning Roe v. Wade. HIPAA covers patients in the womb, but this guidance treats them as non-persons, contrary to law. 15. Department of Housing and Urban Development. HUD prevents social mobility. De-wokify. Political appointees where possible. HUD Secretary should be made member of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. Oversight of foreign ownership to address foreign threats, such as from China. Property appraisals, equity policies from Biden should be ended. Repeal climate change initiatives. Repeal policies that advance housing equity. Prohibit non-citizens, including all mixed-status families, from living in all federally assisted housing. Restrict eligibility when it disincentivizes upward mobility and economic advancement through self-sufficiency, and when it disincentivizes work and marriage. Reduce anti-marriage bias when applying for housing assistance where admissible. First focus on substance abuse and mental health, then on housing, in regards to Housing First policy. Restrict eligibility for first-time home buyers. Implementation of fair housing is now muddled with affirmative action. Local communities should decide which housing they want to allow. Localities, rather than the federal government, should have a say in zoning laws and regulations. Restructuring for better effectiveness. 16. Department of the Interior. Restore American energy dominance. This is put in contrast with Biden's campaign promise of no federal oil. Increase the production of solar and wind energy. Review current agenda. What is 30 by 30 agenda? It is the biggest conservation commitment the world has ever seen. Trump moved the headquarters of Bureau of Land Management to the west, but in 2022 they were moved back east, despite the fact that the majority of the issues are in the west. Overpopulation of wild horses and burros. There is still some land to be given to Alaska and Alaskan natives. Logging has been shut down to the extent that New York harvests more timber than does all of Alaska. Review whether national monuments are appropriately classified. Repeal of the Antiquities Act of 1906, Presidential Authority for Protection of Special Federal Lands. Delist the grizzly bear and the gray wolf from the list of endangered species. Native Americans have coal reserves, some of the cleanest burning coal in the world, but the Biden administration is destroying coal economy. Failure to secure the southern border, southern communities are not safe, drug imports. End federal mandates and subsidies of electric vehicles. Congressional reauthorization for land buyback program for tribal nations. 17. Department of Justice. FBI knew claims of Russian collusion were false, yet cooperated with the Dems to inject the story into the 2016 election. They convinced social media companies that the story about Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian misinformation, when they could have clarified on the authenticity of the source. The department should act in the national interest. Review all major FBI activities, terminate any unlawful ones. Re-emphasize that FBI is not independent of the DOJ. In general, FBI should not combat the spread of mis- and disinformation by Americans who are not tied to any plausible criminal activity. They have no business policing speech, not in public square, print, or online. Get a decision on the cases on death row. Rigorously prosecute as much drug activity as possible, including simple possession of distributable quantities. Focus on Chinese espionage and theft of secrets. No DEI. Enforce prohibition of mailing of abortion pills. Emphasize prosecution of immigration offenses. Assist DHS in getting info on migrants across the states, particularly those inside sanctuary jurisdictions. Political appointees. Statistical reports should be made legible for ordinary people, and there should be clear delineation of what is a government report and what is a third-party report. Prioritize and sufficiently fund National Crime Victimization Survey, which started during the Nixon administration, and enable such reports as Race and Ethnicity of Violent Crime Offenders and Arrestees 2018. 18. Department of Labor and related agencies. No more DEI and left-wing social engineering agenda. Restrict Bostock's application of discrimination to the context of hiring and firing in regards to transgender status and sexual orientation. Pro-life workplace accommodations for mothers unless it would impose undue hardships for the businesses. Congress should incentivize on-site childcare. Sabbath rest. Require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath. Default, Sunday, and for some, Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. Home office is not subject to OSHA. Unless explicitly necessary, prohibit the use of a BA requirement in job descriptions. But that could be government overreach, so end subsidization of BA degrees. Union transparency. They must file detailed financial information, but unions entirely of state or local employees are exempt. Mandate secret ballot votes in order to make a union. H-2A visa program is not subject to any cap, and it surpassed 200,000 for the first time in 2019. Cap and phase down. Or not, conservative opinions differ on this. Would raise prices and maybe would still not attract enough American workers. They do not want seasonal jobs. Phase out the H-2B visa program. But some conservatives also see the value. Investigate foreign labor violations that undermine American workers. 19. Department of Transportation. Private financing to construct infrastructure. In exchange for providing financing, the private partner typically retains the right to operate the asset under requirements specified in a contract, aka concession agreement. Some mistakenly think that private-public partnership would be used without increases in tolls or taxes. High number of injuries on roads. Why? Raising prices on cars disincentivizes people from purchasing newer, safer vehicles. Increasing the production of electric vehicles will make the states more dependent on China and the other countries that control the supply and processing of rare earth minerals needed for EV batteries. Strategic use of airspace. If the US companies are not allowed to fly over certain countries, do not offer any competitive advantage to other foreign carriers. FAA stifles efficiency and innovation. The FAA does not innovate well. It should focus on testing, evaluating, and certifying private sector innovation much quicker than today. Innovation needed in terms of remote and digital control towers. Allow states and local governments to decide whether mass transit is a good investment for them. Here, best course of action is to remove federal subsidies for transit spending. 20. Department of Veterans Affairs. For the first time, VA is allowing access to abortion services. There is lag in hiring and training of new employees, which could result in major problems with adjudication of benefits well into the next administration in 2025. Veteran Health Administration. Rescind abortion and gender reassignment services. Veterans' Bill of Rights is needed. More transparency, like with Medicare. Budget audit. Restructured to make it more effective. Focus attracting high-quality talent for mental health services. Veteran Benefits Administration. Increase automation in processing claims. Implement more technology. Do not have everything just on paper. Ensure political control of the VA. Work with Congress to sunset the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection. It is a redundant, ineffective method of accountability. 21. Department of Commerce. Immediate installment of political leadership in the CFO position and Assistant Secretary for Administration. Advisory committees vetted if their agenda is openly hostile to conservative principles. Historically, conservatives argued that trade and investment-oriented functions of the government amount to corporate welfare or protectionism. That is unlikely to change, especially if it is the norm in the world. So, policy agenda that serves conservative priorities. Tariffs increase costs to downstream industries, but also offer a level playing field for U.S. manufacturers. Prevent U.S. adversaries to exploit the U.S. open investment climate. Strategically place foreign commercial service staff to counter China, foster U.S. innovation, maintain access to critical supply chains and technology wherever access to the market would be difficult without the CS involvement and potentially untapped market and likelihood of expansion. Encourage U.S. companies to shift production out of China and diversify their supply chains. Let us not wait for allies to be on the same page. Private entities in China and Russia serve the interests of the state. Commercial activities routinely weaponized. Strategic decoupling from China is necessary, unless there is a good cause, humanitarian and medical aid, etc. Regulate and restrict export of US persons' data to countries of concern. Break up and downsize the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, one of the main drivers of climate change industry, which is harmful to future US prosperity. Private providers would likely be less costly and more efficient. Withdraw the 30 by 30 executive order. Add a citizenship question to the census. Asking a citizenship question is considered best practice even by the United Nations. And constantly work to strengthen intellectual property rights and combat the view that these limit innovation. 22. Department of the Treasury. Reduce regulation, promote fiscal responsibility, international competitiveness, better respect American people's due process and privacy rights. Counter China, reform AML reporting systems, reversal of the racist equity agenda, reversal of the climate-related financial risk agenda. Reduce marginal tax rates, minimize interference with the operation of free market and free enterprise, minimize adverse impact on family and the core institutions of civil society, consistent application of the tax system, intermediate reform, two-rate individual tax system of 15 and 30%. That eliminates most deductions, credits, and exclusions. Corporate income tax rate should be reduced to 18%. Apparently, it is the most damaging tax. Its primary economic burden falls on workers because capital is more mobile than labor. Deductions related to educational expenses should be repealed. Green deductions should be eliminated. Set a cap on untaxed benefits that employers can claim as deductions. The USA should withdraw from OECD, as it attempts to end financial privacy and imposes regulations on countries with low or no income taxes. More presidential appointees. US should withdraw from both the World Bank and the IMF and terminate its financial contribution to both institutions. If the US is to provide international assistance, it should do so directly and not through international organizations or NGOs. Promote US interests internationally. Committee on Foreign Investment should have the participation of the Department of Defense. U.S. banking law. Congress should repeal the provisions that single out entities that are too big to fail. It gave incentive to expand high-risk investments. It is a faulty premise that large financial institutions cannot fail without causing a financial crisis. End conservatorships of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Move towards privatization of these massive housing finance agencies. It would apparently restore a sustainable housing finance market with a robust private mortgage market that does not rely on explicit or implicit taxpayer guarantees. Transparency of AML-CFT, so that the effectiveness of the whole enterprise can be judged. Treat any participation in any CRT or DEI initiative without objecting on constitutional or moral grounds as per se grounds for termination of employment. 23. Export-Import Bank. A. Should be abolished. It was established in 1934 to provide export subsidies through taxpayer-backed financing to private exporting corporations. In 1981, two-thirds of the subsidies went to giant manufacturers like Boeing, General Electric, and Westinghouse. It operates in effect as a protectionist agency. Counter-argument that the bank could be a weapon to fight China. Misguided notion of what competitiveness is. It was created to finance trade with the Soviet Union. Taxpayers are responsible for the risks that the bank takes. Businesses without political connections are at a disadvantage in accessing this help. The bank does not maintain or create jobs. U.S. exports totally unaffected during the period during which the bank was unable to approve large deals. The largest percentage of exports the bank supported was 4.7%, and even that is an outlier. It cannot be used to fight China. B. The case for the Export-Import Bank. It actually makes a profit. It gives more than $9 billion to the Treasury for debt reduction since 1992. 24. Federal Reserve. In the decades since the Fed was created, there has been a downturn roughly every 5 years. The original purpose was to furnish an elastic currency. In the 1970s, the mission was amended to maintaining macroeconomic stability following the abandonment of the gold standard. It was needed to help the economy avoid or escape recessions, say the supporters of this expanded mandate. It may, according to their view, rather contribute to recessions. What is needed is to limit the Federal Reserve lender of last resort function. The Fed effectively prints money and then borrows it back from banks rather than the banks lending the money to the public. That should immediately end. Any policy proposals would be difficult to implement as they would be disruptions to existing financial institutions. 1. Fed effectively abolished free banking. Neither interest rates nor supply of money controlled by government. The department would handle government money. 2. Commodity-backed money, restoring a gold standard. 3. K% rule, proposed by Milton Friedman in 1960, creating money at a fixed rate, let's say 3% a year. It's too volatile. It would be subject to political pressures and novel effects in the economy. 4. Inflation targeting rules. Fed chooses target inflation rate and then tries to engineer the money supply to achieve that goal. 5. Inflation and growth targeting rules. Nominal GDP targeting, NGDP, Taylor rule. Both place knowledge burden on central bankers. There are political considerations. Fed officials may be unwilling to curb unjustified booms and are all too willing to suppress necessary economic restructuring following a bust. Inflation targeting is easier to explain. It serves as a means to stabilize the dollar's purchasing power. Eliminate full employment from the Fed mandate. Require it to focus on price stability alone. Prevent the institution of a central bank digital currency. Potential unprecedented surveillance. 25. Small Business Administration. The default for providing disaster loans to small businesses, homeowners, renters, and organizations. Advocacy for the interests of the businesses before the government, so they have a voice in the regulatory process. It has a history of mismanagement. Initiatives aimed at inclusivity have created exclusivity and favoritism. Immediate priority is accountability and cleanup of fraudulent COVID-19 loan and grant activity. Explore private sector channels for administering disaster loans. Review the effectiveness of current programs. Privatize where deemed appropriate. 26. Trade. The case for fair trade. Challenge 1. Unfair and non-reciprocal trade, institutionalized in WTO rules. This rule provides little to no incentive for higher tariff countries to lower their tariffs. Collectively, higher non-reciprocal tariffs in China and India block American exporters from selling goods at competitive prices to more than one-third of the world's population. Matching the tariffs to as high as the other countries would lower the deficit more than if the countries decided to lower the tariffs as would be tried to be negotiated. And as they mention in the essay, this is not from free trade economics books. Priority countries to renegotiate with are China, India, EU, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Challenge 2. China's economic aggression and quest for world domination. Xi promised that China will surpass USA by 2049. Further negotiations may be fruitless. Therefore, there may be a need to decouple from China. Prohibit U.S. pension funds from investing in Chinese stocks. Reinvigorate and expand the DHS crackdown on the Chinese use of e-sellers, including third-party sellers and the shippers and operators of major warehouses such as Amazon, eBay, and Alibaba to flood U.S. markets with counterfeit and pirated goods. Crackdown against Amazon. Well, I would want to see that. Reduce or eliminate the issuance of visas to Chinese students and researchers. Hold China accountable for COVID. Nowhere is the Ricardian free trade mirrored in the real world. Yes, prices may be lower, but at what cost? Over time, large trade deficits mean massive transfer of American wealth offshore into foreign lanes. B. The case for free trade. It lowers prices. Free trade is core of American identity. It is not just conservatives who overestimate the power of trade policy. Policies. Implement tariff relief to help counteract inflation. Recent shortage of baby formula, for example, was caused by heavily protectionist regulations. Enact mutual recognition policies with allies. If a product is safe enough for European or Japanese consumers, then it is safe enough for Americans. And vice versa. I don't know about that. Close Export-Import Bank. Potential successor to the WTO should only be open to liberal democracies. Rejoin TPP. Retaliatory harms of tariffs. Many imports become inputs into U.S. manufacturing. They need to raise prices and hurt the export business. On top of this possibility, sometimes companies redirect resources to dodge tariffs. Protectionism builds weaknesses into supply chains. Baby formula shortage, tariffs, and regulations effectively shut down imports out of the country. 98% of the baby formula produced domestically before the shortage. And all of it was made basically by 4 companies. Mutual recognition of other industrialized regulatory standards. If baby formula is safe for EU babies, it is safe for American babies. The reverse is equally true. See, but is it? And protectionism regarding drugs. American companies would gain access to more markets. Trade creates peace, which is a national security issue. Do not decouple from China. US is a strong liberal counterweight. Policy: leave trade only for trade agreements. Most strident fear-mongering against China is not necessary, but it is still a threat to American interests. Policies: and China's developing status in the WTO and other international organizations so it does not exploit its status to gain special privileges. Target bad faith firms individually. Let regular people be in touch with each other. Cultural exchange will do a lot. In 2 generations, that ended the Cold War. 27. Financial regulatory agencies. A. SEC and related agencies. Abolish Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Abolish Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. Regulatory functions of both of these should be merged into the SEC. No woke agenda. Repeal the Dodd-Frank mandated disclosures relating to conflict minerals, mine safety, resource extractions, and CEO pay ratios. Better data reporting. There should be statutory limitations to SEC investigations. No more than 2 years even for complicated matters. Modernize the definition of a commodity, which right now is a laundry list of agricultural commodities, and clarify the treatment of digital assets. Clarify laws on commodity exchanges and U.S. persons, whether having one or small number of U.S. participants requires SEF registration. Foreign swap trading platforms are now likely to exclude all U.S. persons from their platforms. Or if they should seek an exemption from the regulation, definition of a commodity should include digital assets that are not a security. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It was authorized in 2010 by the Dodd-Frank Act, receives its funding through the Fed. Congress should abolish it and return consumer protection to the banking regulators and Federal Trade Commission. Until then, there should be more oversight of how it gives out money, and it should specify more clearly what constitutes deceptive, unfair, and abusive practices to define the scope of CFPB mission more precisely. 28. Federal Communications Commission. FCC is an independent regulatory agency that has jurisdiction over interstate and international communications by radio, television, wire, satellite, and cable. Rein in big tech. There is a huge gap between power and accountability. Impose transparency rules. If they ban someone off their platform, that person should have the right to appeal. There is conflict even among the authors of this chapter. Free speech of users versus free speech of the corporations to exclude content from their private platforms. Currently, traditional telephone customers contribute to a fund that finances broadband networks. How to get funds for this? No agreement among conservatives. 29. Federal Election Commission. The regulation of campaign finance deeply implicates First Amendment principles of free speech and association. It regulates political activity and speech. So, this essay talks about how FEC commissioners are appointed and confirmed. There is bipartisan agreement on how this is done. However, in the almost 50-year history of the FEC, this tradition has only been broken once, when Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid refused to approve one of George W. Bush's nominees. And that is the author of this essay. The DOJ should not engage in prosecutions that defy FEC interpretations and regulations. The President should direct the Attorney General to defend the FEC in all litigation when there is a failure of the commissioners to authorize the General Counsel of the agency to defend it. President should recommend that Congress remove the agency's independent litigating authority and rely on the DOJ to handle litigation. Resist the change of the number of commissioners. Odd number would change the FEC to a political weapon. 30. Federal Trade Commission. Antitrust laws. Business of American business is business and not ideology. Problem: cost of compliance with regulations favors large firms. Should the FTC enforce antitrust or even continue to exist? Some think this is the job of the DOJ. Protecting children online, the FTC should examine platforms' advertising and contract making with children as a deceptive or unfair trade practice, perhaps requiring written parental consent. FTC should institute unfair trade practices proceedings against entities that enter into contracts with children without parental consent. Antitrust enforcement could be done by states' attorneys general. The idea of regional FTC offices, however, runs counter to the conservative idea that any post-New Deal agencies and subsequent government bodies should not have ever even existed. And lastly, an afterword called Onward. After the first edition, a new mandate was published every 4 years. After his first year in office, Donald Trump implemented 64% of the policy recommendations of the 2016 edition. Congratulations! You made it to the end.